Howdy guys, Jimmy Song here. Welcome to another episode of Bitcoin Tech Talk. And I'm sorry I didn't make it last week, but I am going to try to make it up this week by reading a couple of things from my newsletter. Bitcoin Tech Talk is a newsletter that I send out every Monday at 9 a.m. Central Time. And it's been a more narrative form recently, which I will show you. So let's take a look at some of this stuff. So this week's newsletter was about the obvious federal all of the money printing that the Fed is doing, the emergency stuff that happened on Sunday and so on. But I also want to do some coverage of what I wanted to talk about last week, but I was on vacation and you can kind of see my tan there. This will cover both of these. So let's first go through what happened this past week, because as they say, there are decades where nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen, and last week was pretty much one of those weeks where decades happen. Everything seemed to come to a head, and obviously there lots of things are shut down right now. There's a lot of authoritarian policies being put in place all over the world. It's just kind of a crazy time, and I've been talking to people about this, and they're like, I think our kids will remember, this whole incident similar to how we remember 9/11. And if you were around for 9/11, that was kind of a very big and traumatic event. I suspect that this will have something like that, not necessarily because of the virus, but because of all of the economic things that go into it. Anyway, let's start with the first story. The Federal Reserve has lowered the Fed funds rate to 0 to 0.25%. And this is, a mainstream story, obviously. But basically, about an hour before the futures market opened yesterday, they decided to take the benchmark interest rate down to 0. It was at around 1, and before that it was at 1.5. 2 weeks ago they dropped it a half point, hoping that would spur the markets. But they did it again yesterday, and it put it down another 100 basis points. So it's right now in the range of 0 to 0.25. That's a lower bound for the rates. In addition, there's a QE, or quantitative easing, which is another way of saying money printing. Essentially, the Fed, they're the lenders of last resort. They are purchasing $500 billion of Treasury securities. And Treasuries is essentially debt issued by the U.S. federal government. And $500 billion will go towards that. And $200 billion of agency mortgage-backed securities. So they're going back to the mortgage-backed securities again. So that was the impetus for the 2008 bailout. Essentially, the quantitative easing program put a lot of mortgage-backed securities onto the Fed's balance sheet, which they were unrolling for a long time until they stopped that program about 6 months ago. So they're now beginning that program again, where they're starting to buy up mortgage-backed securities. I suspect that this will end with more things than mortgage-backed securities, because it's not the housing market anymore. It's a lot more than that. Basically, it's going to be a lot of it's going to keep rates near 0 for a pretty long time. They're going to try to target inflation at 2%. There is going to be some credit contraction. But the two interesting things out of this announcement that were a little bit different was, I don't think it's in this one, but essentially they have a 0% reserve requirement. Now, this if this sounds like banks can lend out as much money as they want, well, I found out yesterday that since about 2010 or so, banks have more or less been lending out however much they want at any time anyway, and they backfill the reserves later by getting it from the government. So it's not quite as bad as it sounds, because that's essentially how banks have been operating anyway. The reason why there has to be sort of open market operations and $700 billion being printed in order to purchase treasuries and mortgage-backed securities is because a lot of the money that can be pushed out already has. There's a lot of consumer credit, obviously housing credit. Commercial banks have lent out as much as they wanted to businesses that especially want to buy back stocks and so on. But all of that is just like it's been happening, so they can't really push it that way anymore. The only way to do it is actually go out and use the printed money to buy stuff that no one else will buy. That class of assets will grow very, very quickly, I suspect. So anyway, all of this is to say that that the current level of stuff that the central bank of the United States is doing is probably not enough. They just recently announced in like the last few hours that there's another 500 billion of repo that's going to be available. Now that's debt that rolls over fairly quickly, but if it keeps happening, then it's essentially $500 billion that's put out. Remember in 2008 that it was $700 billion for the bailout package. This time, $700 billion just doesn't go as far, and I'll talk about that in the tweet part of the show. All right, so Bitcoin, 3 years after they were complaining about fee congestion, Coinbase finally implemented transaction batching. Instead of sending out a transaction per customer withdrawal of Bitcoin, they finally combined withdrawals into a single transaction. This is a step that, honestly, most exchanges have implemented already. Coinbase was doing it, and it was very inefficient, was costing them a lot of money, especially during times of high fees and so on. And they really got burned during like December of 2017 when fees were especially high. It's really puzzling that it took them almost 3 years to implement, because it's actually not that difficult. And there were organizations like the whole OpTech group that were offering free consulting, more or less, in order to get them to do it. They finally, I guess, took them up on that offer, and they finally implemented transaction batching, which is good for everybody because it reduces the amount of space that they take up in the blockchain. Now there's more available, reduces fees and so on. The thing that's puzzling to me is that they did a lot of other things instead. Among other things, they moved to React.js. That Brian Armstrong announced it on Twitter as if it was like this giant deal, and then he was just like, "Yeah, we moved to React.js." Nobody gives a shit. He doesn't seem to realize that. Who cares what your front-end development architecture is? They only care that the website works. Obviously, they had to, do a lot of things to their backend because they were down all the time. But other things that they did include launching a single ticker for a basket of currencies. Now, they shut that program down because it was just doing so badly. I think it was down like 80% or something, because they included stuff like Ethereum and Bitcoin Cash and many others. They also were bribing users to learn more about certain altcoins. So they gave like airdrops to people that would learn more about Stellar or something like that, which is absolutely insane. But this is what they were doing instead of doing transaction batching, which has a clear benefit to everybody, including themselves from a cost perspective. So I'm glad that they did it. I'm just that company just doesn't seem to care that much about Bitcoin, or is almost antagonistic towards what Bitcoin might want. All right, Leonard Fournier has an interesting paper framing adapter signatures as verifiably encrypted signatures. Now, that's probably going to sound like gobbledygook to people that aren't necessarily paying attention to what's going on in the Bitcoin space. But the paper is absolutely worth reading if you understand at least some of the stuff that he's talking about. essentially, adapter signatures are an interesting innovation that Andrew Polstra presented a few years ago. But essentially, when you publish the signature, you end up and you gave somebody the ciphertext. There's a way to take the ciphertext and the revealed signature and get some information out of it that might be useful to you. And that's what an adapter signature is. It leaks some information as part of the publishing process of publishing signature. And at least in Bitcoin, when you publish a signature, that's required as part of putting your stuff on the blockchain, because the transaction is not valid without a signature. Now, if you have that signature, you can derive essentially a one-time key for something, and that lets you do all sorts of interesting things. And that's how he made verifiably encrypted signatures. And this is something that's in the literature, that's been around for a while. But in the context of scriptless scripts and layer 2 technologies, it allows you to do stuff like atomic swaps and discrete log contracts and many other things in a more elegant way than using hash-based locking. All right, Bitcoin 0.19.1 has been released. These are mostly bug fixes, but like that, it's worth upgrading to if you're on 0.19. TBAST has a route blinding proposal on his GitHub. So essentially, Rusty Russell, who's been working on C-Lending for a while, he's been working on trying to create some sort of an offers protocol. So two nodes can negotiate sort of what the price of something could be, and so on. And this unfortunately, like the current way that routing works, it's through rendezvous routing. It uses one-time keys, so you can't go back and forth, because the one-time key, once it's compromised, then you can't use it again. So you have to have some sort of onion or some blinding in order to basically make it so that you can go back and forth between multiple entities and have this offers protocol. So this is from TBAST, and it's a proposal on how to do some sort of route blinding with onions and all this other stuff to layer all of the encryption so that you get each node gets a payload, but you're not leaking information to anyone else. Really, again, a bit technical, but very much worth reading. All right, everyone, just about anyone that was paying attention to the Bitcoin price this past week was in it for an emotional roller coaster. And I'm sure most of you have gone through a lot of heartache, and or maybe you sensed an opportunity and you bought at the bottom and so on. But the thing that was interesting that I saw was this story from CoinDesk, and essentially they argue that the plunge was foreshadowed by miner inventory data. I didn't quite come to the same conclusion given the data. Essentially, there's a metric called the miners rolling inventory figure. And basically, the amount of inventory that they have versus how much they're generating, that's the ratio. So in like a completely equilibrium world, they would keep 100% of they would sell exactly the amount that they generate every month. If it goes above that, that means that they're selling from some of their reserves. If it goes under that, that means that they're holding some of it back. And this article essentially argues that when they're holding it back, they think that like nobody is there to buy it, or there isn't enough demand or something like that. I take it to mean that this is actually more of an explanation for some of the stock flow stuff that we're seeing, which is that miners hold it back when they think the price is going to rise, and that in turn causes a virtuous cycle where price keeps on rising because there isn't as much supply because the miners are holding it back. We know for certain that miner reserve, or the amount that they're going to produce, halves is starting in May. So this could possibly be a nice explanation for how stock to flow actually works in Bitcoin, and how miner inventory and reserve demand and so on actually works in sync with it, because they tend to hold back at certain points, but also release at others. There may be some that are going bankrupt right now, in which case they had to liquidate. We're not really sure exactly what happened last week, but this is definitely an indicator to keep an eye on. All right, Stephen Livera has written a great Bitcoin newbie guide, and this was published in Spectator Australia. Everything we always wanted to know about Bitcoin, but we're afraid to ask. It's definitely a savings technology, and that's essentially what he argues in this article. And it's a very good article for somebody that is getting interested. I know that a lot of people on Twitter are talking about how like randos or people that they've known for a while are suddenly coming back and saying, "Hey, what about this Bitcoin? And what should I do about it?" That's a good article to send them. Of course, my book is also good if you are interested in that. All right, Nicolas Dorier has written on BTC Pay's, the server foundation introspective. He set up an LLC in the United States in order to fund BTC Pay developers because they got a grant from Square and a bunch of other places. It turns out that like creating this thing is actually kind of a pain in the neck. And he set it up in the U.S. And then he realized actually that's not going to work because there are more contributors from around the world and stuff. So he set up something in Japan, which is where he lives. And there's all this money and like setting it up and going through the regulatory hurdles to set this up. It sounded like a giant pain, and I feel kind of bad that he had to do that. But at the same time, once it's set up, you can do stuff like this. This is another thing that they display, which is that BitC contributed $80,000 to Andrew Camilleri, who's a prolific core contributor to BTC Pay, and that's a good thing. All of that setup has a payoff, but you're asking essentially coders to set up these like complicated things. It's a bit sad that there isn't somebody that can kind of set all this up for you and things like that. White Rabbit has published an analysis of MakerDAO's troubles this week. So MakerDAO had some serious trouble, and they called it Black Thursday for MakerDAO. 8.32 million was liquidated for 0 DAI. So the TLDR is pretty good at this. The MakerDAO liquidations on March 12th and 13th resulted in protocol losses of 5.67 million DAI. And each DAI is worth $1, or it's supposed to be. This happened due to the opportunity to win liquidation auctions with 0 bids, which was 36% of all liquidations. So essentially, if a MakerDAO contract, the lending contract essentially, if you fall below the reserve requirement, they liquidate your coins. And during liquidation, there's supposed to be an auction. Now, that auction is supposed to happen in such a way that that's fair, but also on the blockchain. Unfortunately, Ethereum was seriously clogged on Wednesday and Thursday. And because it was clogged, what ended up happening is that the auctions really didn't have any bids. So whoever, if you could bid 0 and just get into the blockchain with that bid, then you won. And that's what happened to 36% of all liquidations. So a lot of people that were doing, that had been loaned DAI for their Ethereum was liquidated, and not only that, but they didn't get paid anything for the Ethereum that was locked up. So 8.32 million was withdrawn through 0 bids auction in total. You can read the entire thing, but I mean this thing, MakerDAO, DAI, vaults, auctions, it is just an enormously complicated system, and to like code all that into a smart contract and expect it to just work, during all of these times of stress and so on, not very realistic. And that's essentially what happened, is that a lot of people lost a lot of money, and that's kind of a I mean, they're trying now to come up with some way to compensate them. Sounds like they're going to print more MakerDAO in order to make that happen. It's a really, really sad situation. All right, I did do something with Swan Bitcoin here. This is an interview I did as part of their AMA series, if you're interested. Let's go to the other newsletter. This is the one that I sent out last Monday. I didn't get to do a show last Monday, so I'm doing it now. All right, in a world where websites get launched in a matter of days and new features rolled out on SaaS applications on a weekly basis, Bitcoin looks like it's going too slow. This is often the critique of many altcoins, which argue that their coin adds features faster and that they're more willing to experiment. What a lot of people use to the web speed of development forget is that security is a critical element of Bitcoin and has far bigger consequences when it's breached. An error on a website just leads to an error page. An error in Bitcoin may take down the entire network, lead to inflation, or even centralize the currency. One need only look at the Windows ecosystem in the late 90s to the early 2000s to see how drastic the consequences of lax security can do to critical systems. Now, remember, like back in the 90s and 2000s, like there were submarines that were running on Windows that like they had a critical flaw or something like that, and they couldn't dock. This is the seriousness of the security that we have to take Bitcoin. Early is an idea from Gleb Menko that started about 2 years ago. The idea was born out of necessity as a large percentage of Bitcoin network traffic was tied up in figuring out which nodes needed which transactions. The current way in which nodes figure out which transactions need to be transmitted to whom is done very inefficiently. Each node broadcasts a list of transactions it has, putting the onus on receiving nodes to figure out which transactions they need. As transaction IDs are 32 bytes multiplied over many thousands of transactions and many thousands of nodes, thousands of times a day, this takes up a lot of bandwidth. Early changes the equation by making the broadcasting node give a summary of the transactions it has instead of each transaction ID. So essentially, what we do right now is every node just broadcasts whatever it has on a regular basis. It's called an inventory message and says, hey, I have these transactions. Let me know if you need any of them. Now, that's fine, but transaction IDs are like really big, 32 bytes each. And if you have thousands of transactions, that's a lot of transmission back and forth that needs to happen. And the onus is on receiving nodes in order to figure out, hey, I need this, this, and this, and then it's supposed to request it. Erlay changes this. The specification is in bit 330, and I'll go through the article in a bit in my long read. But it talks about what Erlay actually is. It's using set reconciliation to make everything a lot better. And it saves bandwidth by about 40% and so on. And it took 2 years and a lot of review, but that's a pull request implementing Erlay. So kudos to Gleb and many of the other people that did that. Lloyd Fournier has a post on the dead list about the security assumptions around Taproot. So this is, the main... I think it's he just put a period there, but this is the thing that you need to understand in order to know what he's talking about. It's highly technical, but essentially there's a new security assumption that you have to make in order to make Schnorr and Taproot work, which is that the finding two hashes with a fixed difference between them is just as hard as finding two hashes that come out to the same result. That's the cryptographic. That's what a cryptographically secure hash function is. But it's a little bit more than that. So that's what he put into that poster. All right, Stefan Snigirev has created a video tutorial for making a hardware wallet from commodity parts. This is going to be awesome because you can basically make a commodity hardware wallet, and it's not ready for production yet. But the fact that you can even do this thing is an insane thing. A few $100 basically in commodity parts is what's required. Square continues to fund the Bitcoin ecosystem. If you're working on an open source project that benefits Bitcoin, consider applying for a grant. Grantees will be expected to present an execution plan for their project and justification for why they can achieve said plan. Interested individuals or groups should email grants@squarecrypto.org with a proposal outlining how the project benefits Bitcoin, how the individual or team is suited to accomplish the project, and how the project fits the criteria from the post. So they have funded a few projects already: BTC Pay Server, ZMN, and SCPXJ. They have two more that they awarded: John Atack and Tancred Hayes. And essentially, my plea to any developer is that if you're working on something and want to get paid for some of the open source stuff, well, this is the way to do it. It's to go and make your proposal to Square Crypto, and Jack Dorsey might give you some money. That's not a bad idea. Goldman Sachs also published something towards a sustainable future of Bitcoin developer funding, and this article talks about, how do we make this happen? Right? Like how do we fund developers in an open source thing? And basically, it's there are a lot of Bitcoin companies that are free riding off of like the work that's happening on the protocol. I would say like Coinbase is definitely one of them. But some sort of market punishment mechanism for bad actors and a market reward mechanism for good actors is definitely worth considering. So if you see a bad actor, don't do business with them, use somebody else. That's probably the only way as a consumer that we can affect a change in this area. Luke Dash Jr. has written a guide for verifying, the Bitcoin software, straight from, like verifying PGP keys and like having a good OS and verifying fingerprints and so on. This is all, stuff that you should do. Most people don't because they're not comfortable with all of this. So if you always wanted to do this but didn't really understand how to do it, this is an excellent introduction into how to verify all of that. Bitcoin Magazine has published the results of some research. This research was absolutely very interesting. Essentially, they took the Lightning Torch event from January and analyzed each hop and figured out what's going on. Turns out that most people are running Tor because it kind of works out of the box for a lot of these clients, which is excellent. The main point, though, that he made that was interesting is right now, like backing up the channel states is not on by default, and therefore, like there's a lot of data leaking and so on, and so like there's some best practices that are recommended as a result of the research that was done. So well worth reading that as well. Corey Klippenston has written on the intransigent minority in Bitcoin, and this is from Swan Bitcoin. And the whole idea comes from Nassim Taleb's book Skin in the Game. But basically, he believes that somewhere around 1 to 3% of Bitcoin, of the population becoming Bitcoiners, is enough to be the intransigent minority that it becomes mainstream very, very quickly. So. Very good article. You should definitely read it, as part of your economic education. Dergigi has an interesting article. This is a little bit, out there, but Bitcoin's habitats and how to think about it. Is it in the code? Is it in ideas? Is it in people? Is it in nodes? It's a philosophical / metaphysical article that I think sheds a little bit of light on how interesting Bitcoin actually is from that perspective. The other thing about price that happened is this story from Chainalysis. Essentially, they argue that based on the reason that the price dumped was because of the Plus token scam. And basically, they have an enormous amount of Bitcoin supply that they've been dumping on the market whenever the price gets high enough. There's a lot of money around Plus token that that are going to these plus token wallets, and somehow they're making it into the market. So there's about 45,000 BTC and 800,000 Ethereum that have been laundered and so on, and they've traced where it's been going. It ends up at exchanges or OTC desks or something like that. They've cashed out something like $185 million worth, but there's still more to go. So until that downward pressure sort of subsides, we're still in for a bear market, I guess is their argument. So it's an interesting analysis and something to definitely think about. Justin Sun bought Steam, but he's been using the exchanges to take over the network. I think I talked about this on Tone's podcast. And first, the U.S. government is suing 113 virtual currency accounts. This is mostly money from North Korea, and they can't sue the actual North Koreans. So they are suing 2 Chinese nationals and a bunch of virtual currency accounts, including Bitcoin addresses, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Open Bazaar has laid off one of its founders. It's kind of a sad story. They premised their company on Bitcoin being a method of payment. It turns out not that many people are interested. So 5 years hence, they've contributed a lot to Bitcoin Cash, started taking lots of other currencies and so on, but they just haven't been very successful. All right. Pretty much every conference has been canceled for the next few months, so I am home. But you can read or listen to my books, including the Little Bitcoin book, which has 109 ratings and so on. All right, so let's proof of patronage. All right, so let's go through my Twitter feed real quick, and then we will do our long read. All right, so let's go back because it's been a while since I've done a show. So I think we have a bunch of tweets to go through. All right, let's see. It was before white paper. All right, so AMA tomorrow. I did that. Nuggets news video. That's also there. Stocks go up when the Fed cuts rates because more money gets printed via debt whenever they do. This new money finds its way into stores of value like stocks and real estate. Markets are just front running. Bitcoin is now going up as well, solidifying its store of value status. Obviously, it's gone down since then, possibly due to some of the plus token stuff, possibly other things going on with minor reserve and the reserves being dumped or something like that. But that's I expect this sort of dynamic to happen more as Bitcoin is seen as a store of value. The more money that gets printed, the more of it will eventually find its way to Bitcoin. Less than 10,000 blocks to go. That was obviously talking about the halving. That was as of March 3rd. Let's see where we are right now. We are at block 621,872. So 630,000 is when the halving is happening. So we got about 8,100 and change, 8,100 and change to go before the halving, which is kind of coming up, which is about for 2 months to go. All right. I know if I feel some way about something public, there's a good chance that emotion is how someone wants to make me feel. Quitting the news, self-reflection, and self-discipline are my main defenses against such a broad attack surface. So I'm just pointing out that the media is manipulating you, and many of you have been manipulated. But if you want to be defending against that, you have to cut off the news, have a lot more self-reflection, and take some time to harden your self-discipline, especially emotionally. The world is fragile. Bitcoin is not. Any systematic disruption is going to show this. It feels like Bitcoin is going to prove its anti-fragility again soon. And this is interesting in light of what's happened since, which is circuit breakers and more money printing and so on. That's just showing how fragile fiat money is. Bitcoin has none of those things, and it continues to survive, maybe even thrive. Governments are good at using any crisis to take our liberties. Fear is a strong antidote to our natural desire for freedom. And this is getting kind of ridiculous at this point, right? Restaurants are being forced to be closed and so on. It's not a coincidence that public safety is always the justification for taking away liberties. Remember that during the Reign of Terror, the most violent subcommittee basically of the government was the Department of Public Safety. They were the ones that were guillotining everybody else. So you have to be very careful about the government taking away your freedom. And right now the authoritarianism is basically running free and doing whatever it wants because people are scared. And that's just kind of what I'm pointing out there. All right, Bitcoin derangement syndrome starts when you mistake your luck getting into Bitcoin early with skill in identifying new trends. Technical people are a little less susceptible, but they're by no means immune. A lot of derangement going on when a lot of these people that think that they are super smart when really they just got lucky. All right, Bitcoin derangement syndrome grows when you believe your own reasons for buying or not buying Bitcoin are why everyone else should buy or not buy Bitcoin. Those who are familiar with Austrian economics are a little less susceptible, though by no means immune. So this is something that I've been seeing a lot lately on Twitter, which is that, hey, you need to buy Bitcoin because of this, or you need to sell Bitcoin because of this. Not everyone's going to agree with you, man. And like believing that to be some sort of a moral imperative tends to not work. So that's the other thing. Fiat, paying a bargain price for what you don't need. Bitcoin, paying a fair price for what you really want. Fiat tricks you into unnecessary consumption. Bitcoin rewards high quality goods and services. And this is just something that happens with fiat money, is that people buy stuff that they don't really need. Although, people, at least in this crisis, are cutting back on stuff that they don't need. So this might be a good thing. Quick failure is a blessing, and it's the long and drawn out failures that suck the life out of you. Hence, wishing quick failure for people that have been scammed is compassionate. And this is why I think a drop in altcoins would be a really good thing, because it'll wipe people out early rather than in a long and drawn out way. And not get them to deceive themselves. A quick failure is almost always better. I'm thinking of experimenting with giving Bitcoin in a different way. First, it's time locked. The recipient can't spend for 6 months. Second, it's backed up. If the recipient doesn't move the coins in 18 months, I get to take it back. Any holes in my scheme. So this is something that I've been working on with my wallet. And you can create scripts like this. It's basically a time locked output. So you time lock it to 6 months for your friend, who after 6 months, they can unlock it using their private key or whatever. But like 18 months later, they discover they haven't done anything. So in that case, you can take it back and you can recover that Bitcoin instead of having it basically go away. Non-technical people tend to leave Bitcoin because of greed. Technical people tend to leave Bitcoin because they didn't get their way on something and want more control. In other words, pride. Not a hard and fast rule, just a general tendency. And that's something that that a lot of people, that it's just a pattern I've noticed. A lot of the sort of like non-technical people, they go and create their own coin because they can print their own money. The technical people tend to go and do something on their own, often with those same non-technical people, because they didn't get their way on something in Bitcoin. So Larimer and Vitalik Buterin are two of the early people that did that and basically scammed people whether they wanted to or not. Contest, create a pay-to-witness script hash address that does what my tweet describes along with the witness script on testnet lock to this key. And this is something that Dustin Detmer did, which is great. So you can go and take a look at how he created that time lock and what he did. But basically, it's all there. It's the capabilities in Bitcoin script have been there since like 2016 or so. It's just that no one's really created wallets to take advantage of it. Mike Bloomberg could have given every American 10,000 sats with the money he spent on his campaign. just subtweeting some of the stuff that I've been hearing. Seems near every conference in March and April has postponed to the fall. Fall is going to be a giant glut of Bitcoin conferences. And guys, that's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of conferences in the fall. The amount of really bad statistical analysis on Twitter is staggering, sample bias. So this is something that I'm seeing a lot, is that they linearly project whatever percentage they think are susceptible based on hospital statistics. Remember, people in hospitals are already sick. You got to get a good sample, not a bias sample, but an objective sample. And most of these studies, from what I can tell, are not objective samples. There are people that are suspected of being sick already, and then they test them. So that's just one of the many things. And like the test accuracy, false positive, false negatives, like very few people seem to understand what those mean and how that affects statistics yet. Negative interest rates are coming, and that means Cantillon effects will accelerate. The leverage the rich will be able to use to increase their wealth at the expense of everyone else is going to be scary. And this is kind of already happening, right? Like a lot of giant businesses and people with access to low rate loans, and the rates are going to get even lower, so they're going to be able to leverage that much more. So that's going to be kind of crazy. You're an adult now. Pick 4. Well-parented children. Meaningful purpose. General overall health. Being drama and anxiety free. Politics, news, doom porn, sports, celebrity gossip, Facebook, Instagram, Netflix, TV, movies. What you've picked reflects your values, admit it or not. This was a subtweet of another tweet that I saw about you're an adult now, pick 3. But really, you can drop the stuff that doesn't matter, and those are clearly the bottom 4. And if you do, you'll do much better. Doom porn is worse than real porn because it makes you think you're doing something productive when you're not. Reading one more story, watching one more video doesn't change anything other than increase your anxiety. And sadly, I'm seeing a lot of people fall into this on Twitter where they just want to read one more story about the stupid virus. You're not going to be able to do anything about it unless you happen to be an expert in vaccine making or something like that. So don't worry about it. Just live your life, right? And do something productive. United we stand, divided we fall. True for a centralized system, not true for Bitcoin. And this CZ was talking about what happened with Steam. It should fall, honestly. All right. Watch the media blame force majeure for the incoming slowdown in the economy. Just remember the system was fragile to begin with. By the way, most people are not doing the crazy stuff like outside only for work or complete isolation. Most people are just sort of avoiding public gatherings. Money used to mean validation that your product or service was something the market wanted. Now it more likely means you're a crony to those who print it, and that's kind of true. You're not necessarily making anything useful. All right. Let's see. Going the long way around this faster. Yeah, that was what I published. Imagine thinking Bitcoin is the volatile asset after today. Well, that was on a day when S&P 500 went crazy. But Bitcoin is still clearly volatile. To no coiners, when Bitcoin hits 100,000, you'll be kicking yourself for not buying. What you won't remember is that you felt all the uncertainty and fear, and that is why you didn't buy when the price actually dipped. Holders know, and that's why they deserve the gains and you don't. This is probably one of the highest rated tweets that I had the past 2 weeks. But it's true. If you're a no coiner, you're not going to remember that you felt the fear and just kind of kick yourself and call other people lucky. Really, the people that are holding, they had to overcome a lot to be able to hold. There's a death spiral of journalists who destroy their credibility by warning about mining death spirals. It just bothers me so much. Already a lot of miners have gone offline because it's not profitable for them to mine. And that's why we're seeing more full blocks and and stuff like that. But the difficulty adjusts to compensate. So that's what we're going to see. Amazing the amount of restraint people are able to show when they're really scared. Now imagine that restraint going towards self-discipline and entrepreneurship. Hopefully that's motivating to you. It probably wasn't for most people because it wasn't a very popular tweet. Get ready for state intervention into nearly every industry through money printing. Every central bank is getting ready to nationalize every sick and dying too big to fail business. And we're seeing that, right? QE is happening. That's probably going to be expanded. I don't think 700 million is going to do anything. They're probably going to go into the trillions very, very quickly. Honest question: are there gold bugs under 30? Turns out there are some, but not as many as I thought. This is what everyone in authority is thinking. Don't let a good crisis go to waste. There are going to be a lot of changes, and they'll mostly benefit those who are in power. And that's it's just a warning. It's going to happen. Looks like a giant liquidity crunch, monetary contraction is happening, and more is on the way. Central banks will try as hard as they can to expand money to combat this. Thing is, they've more or less emptied their chamber of all the bullets that they have. I think the only thing left is really more QE. They've dropped rates all the way down. But banks have been lending as much as they wanted anyway. There wasn't really a reserve requirement beforehand. They've kind of formally gotten rid of it. But I mean, this is what's going to happen. Everyone isolated in their pods, scared to come out into the real world. We're one step closer to the matrix. Volatility destroys the anti-fragile like leverage positions or weak hands. Reality is that most of the system is pretty fragile. So yeah, a lot of things falling down. Today proves that institutions buying Bitcoin has a flip side. So that was when a lot of it done. Could have been leverage traders as well, as Mike Novogratz pointed out. But yeah, it's it has a flip side. If you want institutions in, they might be weekends and dump a lot at once. The rich love central banks and circuit breakers because it reduces the risk of leverage debt, and they have a lot of leverage debt. This is how they get rich. Bitcoin does not have a central bank to stabilize and punishes risk-taking through volatility. So if you try leverage trading in Bitcoin, you're going to get wrecked, is essentially it. Whereas if you just hold, you're not going to get wrecked because you're not in a leverage position. So holding is a more honest way, and that's, I think, where we're going to see. Reminder, not your keys, not your Bitcoins. Volatility exposes flaws, and there will be businesses who will be caught with their pants down. Unlike the fiat systems, there's no lender of last resort, so you're just going to lose your Bitcoins if they're insolvent. So yeah, make sure you take the money out of these places. I think Warren Buffett's quote is that when the tide goes out, you find out who's been skinny dipping. There's probably some skinny dipping out there, right? People that are doing fractional reserve or something else. Monetary contraction or liquidity crunch is essentially money disappearing into thin air that it came from. That causes the prices of everything to drop. The problem isn't that there are no safe havens. There are. The problem is that we have a terrible unit of account. So the unit of account that we're using, the dollar, contracts and expands. Expands mostly, but contracts at kind of random or like during Black Swan events like 2008 and now. And the only way to sort of fight that for the Federal Reserve, at least at this point, because they've used all their bullets in their chamber for dropping interest rates, is essentially to buy up securities out on the market with open market operations. And that the fact that we have a terrible unit of account is what's caused a lot of the badness. This is what it looks like when Doomporn goes mainstream, and yeah, I mean that like just the announcements the last few days, it's been absolutely crazy. The fearful are hoarding, worrying about stuff they can't control, and yelling at others that aren't doing what they want. The brave are keeping quiet and stacking. Which are you? Like the amount of like sort of imperatives that are on Twitter. It's like stay the F home or whatever. It's just kind of like, why are you telling me what to do? I'm a sovereign individual. Why, stay in your lane, man. Like, what you think is best might not be actually the best, and you might think that you have truth on your side or whatever, but it just grates me the wrong way. That's all. People hoarding producible goods are about to get a lesson in scarcity. Hand sanitizers, toilet paper, and frozen pizza will be produced en masse in the next month or so. The only things worth hoarding are things that are actually scarce. The scarcest of those is Bitcoin. So that's something that people are going to figure out. They've been hoarding toilet paper and frozen pizza or whatever. All those things are going to be produced because the manufacturers have a process to produce more of it. And if there's a lot of demand, they're going to make more profit. This is how the market works. The only thing that that really can't be produced en masse is Bitcoin, and that's going to be shown very, very clear. M2 money supply October 2008, 8 trillion bailout, 700 billion, or 8.75% of M2 money. This time around, it's 15.5 trillion, so 700 billion is only 4.5%. So it's not going to affect things nearly as much as last time. The 700, we've almost doubled the money supply since the last bailout, or since 2008. So that means that the 700 billion just won't have that same effect. And a lot of the credit that's been going into or the debt that's been issued has been consumer credit, and that's not necessarily that productive. So it's going to require way more, and that's I hope, and that's something that I think I expect to see. I hope the current crisis gives us more useful robots. Also, telepresence is totally underrated. All right, so those are all my tweets from the past 2 weeks. Hopefully that helped you. All right, let's do our long read from Sam Wouters. I'm writing this non-technical explainer because I believe Youre is one of the most important performance improvements to Bitcoin yet. Youre will help the Bitcoin network to remain decentralized by reducing unnecessary communication between the participants in the network. So this is Bitcoin's awesomeness and time. After Youre, it'll go on a better trajectory. I first read about it in the highly recommended Bitcoin Optech newsletter. If you're not subscribed to that one, please subscribe. Besides my own newsletter, I think that's one that you definitely have to read if you're a technical person. Special thanks to the authors for making it so accessible to a somewhat technical audience. I hope to make it even simpler for others below. How broadcasting a transaction works today. This is Bob. Bob wants to send a Bitcoin transaction. The reason why isn't relevant for this explainer, but you can make an educated guess when Lambo. He obviously wants his transaction to be included in the blockchain as soon as possible. To achieve this, it helps if many of the participants in the Bitcoin network know that Bob's wallet has broadcast his transaction. This will increase the chance of his transaction being included in the next block of transactions that is created, which happens every 10 minutes on average. As Bob is more interested in doing other things with his money, he does not have his own node on the Bitcoin network. Instead, he trusts Alice's node to broadcast the transaction and receives from his wallet. Alice's node first checks Bob's transaction to see if his wallet signed it. It also checks whether Bob has spent this Bitcoin before by looking through its records of currently unspent transactions known as UTXOs. What are UTXOs? Explainer. A Bitcoin transaction has an input and an output. Every transaction output can in turn become an input for the next transaction. To make sure that you're not spending the same Bitcoin twice, the node could check its entire history of hundreds of millions of transactions to find if the same transaction input has been used before. As you can imagine, that is a lot of work to do every time. To be more efficient, the node will go through the entire history once to create a list of all transaction outputs that have not been used as transaction inputs yet. This is known as the unspent transaction outputs, or UTXOs for short. Today in Bitcoin, there are around 56 million UTXOs, which take up around 3 gigs of storage space. The entire Bitcoin blockchain, on the other hand, is 220 gigabytes and contains over 4.22 million transactions. Each time a transaction is sent, the node removes old UTXOs that were spent and adds new ones to keep the list up to date. Also, note that the 56 million UTXOs, if you add them up, that's the entire supply of Bitcoin that exists. After everything checks out, Alice's node tells the 8 nodes it is connected to about Bob's transactions. Bob may be trusting Alice's node blindly, but its peers don't. They will perform the same checks Alice's node did on Bob's transaction. As you can imagine, many nodes will hear about Bob's transaction multiple times after that, as they are all connected in different ways and don't know who receives what information. A lot more messages are being sent than necessary. While this gives Bitcoin users a high degree of certainty that all nodes in the world will know about their transactions, it puts a burden of this luxury on the nodes. These nodes send and receive far more data than necessary. To be precise, the research paper shows that 44% of all traffic between nodes are these kinds of unnecessary messages. This adds a lot of pressure to nodes, especially those that may not have amazing internet connections, or those whose owners can't just keep paying more and more for their internet subscription as Bitcoin is used more. This problem is addressed by the proposed Youre protocol. So basically, you have transactions that Bob sends and it gets transmitted, but they get transmitted multiple times, right? I have this transaction, and they communicate. And that the onus is on the receiving node to figure out if they have it or not. And that means that it was sent data that it probably didn't need to be sent. So that's what Youre is fixing. How broadcasting a transaction works with Youre. While you were busy learning about UTXOs and the extra traffic for nodes, Bob has learned how to set up his own Bitcoin node from a tutorial. Bob has made Alice one of his peers and broadcasts his transaction to her and 7 of his other peers. After verifying his transaction, Bob's peers also tell 8 of their peers. Once this transaction has gone across the network, not every node has received Bob's transactions. If you were not included in someone's group of 8 peers, you may have missed out. Not to worry, a node doesn't have to hope it will hear about Bob's transaction. It will instead periodically request a sketch of all the transactions that all of its peers have received. Each peer sends a sketch that represents all the transactions it receives, which takes up less data than sending every single transaction in full. The node will then produce its own sketch of the transaction it has received and compare this sketch to the ones it received, like a game of find the difference. The node can then request the exact transactions that are missing from its own sketch from its peers. So this is what's called set reconciliation. So you have 2 nodes that have some set of transactions, and they compare notes instead of comparing their inventory. And this is a lot faster and better. A good metaphor to understand the difference between the sketch and the missing transaction is a panorama view of a landscape, all of the transactions, or a detailed close-up of the individual flower or rock in that landscape on transaction. So it's basically like you got these 2 pictures, what's the difference between them instead of looking at each individual pixel of that picture. Advantages and disadvantages. There is one drawback in comparing these sketches to find the difference. It takes slightly longer for a transaction to be known by all of the nodes in the global Bitcoin network. Since Bitcoin gets a new block every 10 minutes on average, this slowdown seems well worth it to alleviate much of the heavy work that nodes do, or the bandwidth that they take up. If in turn nodes have to do less work, then it becomes easier for people to run their own node, and the Bitcoin node can remain decentralized. We would not want a situation in which few big data centers are the only ones capable of running a full node, as all of us would have to trust them for our transactions. That puts us back to a world of centrally controlled financial institutions, while Bitcoin was invented as an alternative to that. Just a note, this is how basically Ethereum currently runs. They have a central node on AWS, and that's you don't want that. But what if box? You can try to think of ways how this early protocol could fail, but so have the authors of the paper. In there, they describe the optimal parameters to compare these sketches and what steps a node can fall back on in case it doesn't manage to find the difference between the sketches. The authors also tested the performance of this protocol on a simulated network of 60,000 nodes and a live network of 100 nodes spread across the world. If nodes would increase their number of peers from 8 to 32, they would normally have a 300% increase in traffic. With the earlier protocol, this is just 32%. So when can we see Youre being included in Bitcoin software? Right now, the research paper is open for feedback. The improvement proposal has now been published, and an implementation is now up for review. If no objections are raised by the other researchers, testers, or developers, Nontechnical plans to write a Bitcoin improvement proposal. Yeah, so that's all done. Youre would only require 584 lines of code. It doesn't require any fundamental rule changes in Bitcoin that would make the new version of the software compatible with older changes. So getting it activated will be much easier than some of the other changes to Bitcoin that have been made. I hope you enjoyed this explainer. It was a bit of an experimentation for me. If you liked it or have suggestions for other Bitcoin related topics, please let them know. Yeah, so Sam did a great job explaining all of this, but basically Youre reduces the bandwidth requirement for Bitcoin nodes, and it took a lot of review because there were possible attacks against it that they had to steal against. And reviewing that and making sure that the entire network is not denial of serviceable, that's a very, very good thing. So that's about it for those. Let me see if, wow, there's a lot of chat. Let's see if there's any questions. Is there anyone having trouble getting audio notifications? Well, if you hit subscribe, I think I think that's how you get it. All right, so thank you guys. I don't see any questions, but again, my books are on Amazon. I know many of you are now at home, so You can go buy the Little Bitcoin book for $11.39 on Amazon. You can also buy Programming Bitcoin, which is available on Amazon for $45.66. There's also, you can listen to it on audio, to the Little Bitcoin book on audiobook. It's also available in Spanish and Portuguese. A few more people than I expected this week, probably because most of you are stuck at home. Anyway, thank you so much for all of the encouragement that you guys have given me. I do want to make more of these shows, especially as many of you are stuck at home. Let me know what you think might be interesting. Please subscribe, pound that like button. Let me know, in the comments what sort of content that you would like to see. I will try my best to bring that to you. Anyway, Fiat Delenda Est. This song is